I didn't want to say that.
That would have been a killer for him.
Out there this weather.
Our son-in-law had a chance because I asked him if we would watch his kids this afternoon. Our grandchildren. He said, no, I won't watch your, I love your grandchildren. I want you anytime, but I don't want you to go out.
Yeah, I love you too. I don't want you to die of hypothermia.
Oh, man.
Right. Oh, dear. Well, why don't we begin? The subject that we're going to be dealing with for the next 3 weeks is not only voluminous, there are going to be all kinds of things we can only just barely touch on, but I think also we need to recognize at the beginning that we'll get into some controversial stuff, things that people have widely divergent opinions about, and that's fine. We should be able to talk about things like that in the church where we trust each other and we don't have to agree on everything, especially when it comes to issues other than the core of the faith. So I want you to feel free to ask questions or make your comments or whatever. I want you also to understand I'm coming at this whole subject of church and state and Christian citizenship from the perspective of the Bible and our theology, not from any political perspective. Now, sometimes people hear statements and they, oh, it sounds like the Republican, oh, it sounds like the Democrat. That may be so, but that's not the perspective that I intend to bring to our discussion. We're here as Christian citizens in a democracy, and we want to try to get some handles on what's that mean? How do we function in our particular milieu of what we call separation of church and state? So with that understanding, we can dig in. And I want to give you an idea of how we're going to work these 3 weeks. I don't know whether you'll be here all 3, but if you are, this is the way it'll go. Today I mostly want to talk about a little bit of history of how we've gotten where we are today and the whole concept of separation of church and state and what that means. And what we understand as Christians to be the role of government. So that's kind of where we'll be today. Next week, I want to talk more about, okay, given our understanding of the role of government then, how do we function as both Christians and citizens within this democracy? And so that will get us more into how we act. The third week, we just were able to work this out. We're going to have a guest with us. Her name is Cindy Crane. She's a Lutheran pastor from Madison, and she's just been appointed as the new director of what's called the Lutheran Office of Public Policy in Wisconsin, which you may or may not know anything about. That office is, you might call it a branch office of our ELCA, because there are similar ones in some other states. And it's there specifically for the purpose of interpreting to our legislators in Madison some of the positions that we as a whole church at the conventions of the ELCA have taken on subjects that are likely to come up for action. And so she'll be here to talk about that office, what it does, and how we can be involved in what they do. So that's kind of the way we'll go here in these 3 weeks. Any questions so far? Okay, good. I'm nearsighted, so I go like this when I want to look at you, and I go like this when I want to look at my notes. So that's the way it goes with age. Well, to begin with, we need to recognize that when we talk about church and state, we're talking about two institutions. not just concepts, but to organized institutions. The state is basically government at its various levels, federal, state, local, and church, likewise, national and synodical in our case, and then local in our congregations. But these are institutions. They're not just concepts out there. They exist in very specific and concrete ways, and that needs to be taken into account. But if we're going to understand where we are today, we also have to review briefly how we got here. There's a very helpful book. Actually, it's the one that got me started on this whole thing a couple of years ago. This is an interesting subject. It's called American Gospel by John Meacham. I don't know if you know that name. He's a well-known journalist, used to be editor of Newsweek magazine, has won a Pulitzer Prize. I don't know whether it was for this book or some other one, but he does a nice job of reviewing the 200 and some year history of our nation. Well, actually, beginning even before we became a nation as colonies. One of the conclusions that he draws, and I certainly draw from his book and my own experience, we do not have a wall of separation between church and state. We have sort of a curtain. And sometimes we push over on one side of the curtain, sometimes we push over on the other. There is no easily defined line that says this is church, this is state. They have an influence on each other, and it's always, to some extent, a matter of perspective and opinion as to when state should be dominant and when church should have its influence. So it's good to have that in the back of our minds when we take up this subject. The history is somewhat instructive. You know, when the Pilgrims came over here, they were escaping what they felt was a very oppressive government. First in Holland and then somewhat in England as well, because they were dissidents. They didn't want the state religion in either place. And if you recall, in most of Europe, as the result of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, a kind of unwritten rule took effect that in Latin it was called eius regius, cuius regius, eius religius. In other words, whoever rules decides what the religion's going to be. And that was the way it went in most of Europe. So they were escaping from that. They wanted much more freedom. But when they got here, what they didn't want was freedom for everybody. They wanted freedom for their aspect of religion. And as the Plymouth colony developed and so on, they began to use police power to insist that everyone toe the line with their form of religion. And it was rebels against that, like Roger Williams, who said, that's not the way I want to worship God. And they went off to Rhode Island and established Rhode Island. That's sort of the way it went in this country. In Virginia, it was more the Church of England, although they weren't quite as oppressive as the Pilgrims, but still, they brought a lot of that which they thought they were escaping with them. And so while they had the freedom now to express their faith the way they wanted to, they weren't so sure they wanted others to do it differently. And so we've got that in our background, and it's still there, as you're well aware, I'm sure. Now, I was thinking as I was preparing my thoughts here, it's probably a good thing that the Constitution wasn't written in the 17th century. Otherwise, they might have written into the Constitution, you know, we're all going to be like the Pilgrims, or we're all going to be like the Church of England. They had a century and a half to kind of mull that over and fight it out among themselves and be influenced by the Enlightenment and other factors. So that by the time our Constitution was written, there was far more openness to diversity. And so that's why we do have separation between church and state. That one is not to dominate the other in either case. That's the theory. Now, we still wrestle with that in some ways. What I think it's important for us to recognize is that both the state, the government, and the church, whichever church we're talking about, has a God-given purpose. And they're different, quite different. The state government, whatever you want to call it, has a God-given purpose in this world. Now, we sometimes forget that. And we think, you know, well, God's only concerned about the church and religious life and so on. That's not biblical. We'll talk some more about that. But the state has as much a divine origin as does the church. If we read all of Scripture, you may recall the history of the Israelites coming out of Egypt and into the Promised Land, and then for a time they were just 12 affiliated tribes, and they didn't have much government. When some threat arose, then some charismatic leader would be raised up to lead them. That was the period of the Judges, and you read about that in the book called Judges. But eventually they realized they needed to be more unified if they were going to both arrange their own internal affairs, but also be strong enough to fend off the outside threats. So they began to ask God to appoint a king. Now, God wasn't too pleased to do that, according to the books of Kings, because God knew the danger of power and what could happen if one person was given all this power as king. But on the other hand, the people were confused and muddled and making a mess of things and needed leadership. And so, given the need to cope with those problems, God, according to the account, rather reluctantly said, okay, you can have a king. And so that's how they became a monarchy. At first, of course, God choosing a person to be king and making it known through the priest or the prophet. So it began as a God-given purpose to have government. The purpose throughout the Old Testament, and here I'm moving down a little bit. Before I get to that, I want to say something about in our own day, because we don't have this clear-cut curtain or wall between church and state. The Lutheran Church back in the 60s and early 70s, I guess, really wrestled some with, well, what's it mean, separation of church and state? How are we to function with each other? And the Lutheran Council in the USA, which no longer exists, but at that time was a conference, if you want to call it, to bring together the Lutheran churches that eventually merged and formed the ELCA, and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod before it got arch-conservative and kind of restrictive, worked together on a number of things. And so they did a study of church and state, and the conclusion that was arrived at is this, that church and state are institutionally separate, but functionally interactive. Now, that's an interesting concept. I'm not sure that it's been spelled out that way by any other churches, but I think it says in a few words how we need to look at each other. Institutionally, separate. Neither one dominates the other. Each has its function. Excuse me, we'll talk more about that. But functionally interactive. We have to work with each other. And that shows up in things like chaplains in the military or in military installations, hospitals and so on, prisons. It shows up in the fact that religious institutions like Lutheran Social Services or others get government contracts to carry out some of the things that government wants to do, but says there are those organizations which are better equipped to do it, so we'll fund them in order to do it on behalf of the whole society. There are other ways in which we function together. As a church, I've already mentioned the fact we occasionally develop position papers on some issue and then encourage our members to say, if you agree, then let your representatives know, so we try to influence government in that way. So, institutionally we're separate, but functionally we interact. Government's going to interact with the church, and we as members of the church need to interact with government. Is that okay so far? You got anything you want to comment there? As I say, if you want to speak up, just do so. Okay, we'll forge ahead. I was getting ahead of myself down here when I talked about the formation of the first government, biblically speaking, with the formation of the people of Israel. When God created the people of Israel and then the kingdom of Israel, it's pretty clear from the Old Testament that God had purpose in mind, and that was that there should be authority that would create community. Community is extremely important as a concept, even though it's not a word used a lot in the Old Testament. It's a comprehensive understanding of what God was about in creating Israel. That there should be an authority which would see that the weak, the vulnerable, the immigrant, and so on, were cared for. And it's often given in sort of formulistic way that the state was to look out for the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner, who was the immigrant, the visitor. But it was more comprehensive, and it meant everybody who was weak and needed assistance to be cared for. And that was an important function of the state. You find that in many ways, and I've given some biblical references here. I'm not going to refer to them specifically. You can look them up at home if you want. But the justice, the peace, the welfare of all residents, including foreigners, is something that the government's supposed to do, and the prophets of the Old Testament are very strong in this, very consistent on this score. The Psalms show it in some places as well. And it's a theme which runs heavily through the Psalms, the prophets, and the latter part of the Old Testament. It's sometimes overlooked that this is the nature of government as God determines it, because we talk about the prophets from a Christian perspective as foretelling the coming of the Messiah. That was not their primary purpose. They were intended to be the mouthpiece of the Lord, if you want to put it that way, to their contemporaries. They were saying what was wrong with the state and the society and what needed to be corrected. And so the whole emphasis, that again and again and again among the prophets was, here's what's wrong, here's what needs to be done, here's what God is saying. We need to care for the vulnerable, we need to establish justice, we need to do righteous things. And of course, they were so loud and so consistent on it, there were many, especially in power, who got very tired of them, even tried to kill them, like Jeremiah. So that is a consistent theme through the Old Testament, especially among the prophets. Now, there were some things that I wanted to add on here. Well, another book that I found very helpful is this one called Just Politics. Now, you can take the word just both ways, you know. And it's written by Ronald Sider, who is a leader among the evangelical churches today. He's not a fundamentalist, but he is very much into the evangelical school, which we Lutherans, by the way, use that term. We are the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. For us, it means strictly adherence to the gospel, because the Greek word evangel meant gospel as it got translated. And so you might say our national church name means the Gospel-Centered Lutheran Church in America. The press and popular opinion sometimes uses that word evangelical to group certain kinds of churches which have tended in the past to stress conversion and one-on-one relationships with God and not be much concerned about society, until they started saying, wait a minute, we don't like what's happening politically, and then they've gotten more involved. Well, Ron Sider, I would say, is on the, words are hard to come by because they get such political meaning. He's well-grounded biblically and theologically, but he's a progressive person within the evangelical school. And he has much good to say in this book about the meaning of church and state. I don't agree with him on everything. I think he becomes a kind of a fundamentalist when he talks about abortion and homosexuality. But when it comes to talking about the nature of government, I think he's very good. So I want to quote a couple of sentences to you here. He says, one of many institutions in a complex, differentiated society, the state has the unique responsibility of providing the right framework so that all persons and all institutions in society treat each other justly and have the freedom to be and do what they ought to be and do. To prevent disorder and promote the common good of the entire society, we need an institution that has the authority and power to provide a good, accepted framework in which all the other institutions, as well as all persons, can both enjoy their own freedom and work together effectively. In, a couple of sentences, I think he says very nicely what should be our understanding of the nature of government. And so when we think about it in our contemporary situation, I see it this way. We have very powerful institutions in the country. We have big business. We have, as a matter of fact, it's become international business. It supersedes even our own country. We have powerful organizations, whether they be corporations or, in some cases, unions, or some cases private organizations, but extremely well funded. Some foundations, for instance, are very influential in our society. Anyway, we have very powerful organizations. We need the government to be even more powerful in order to set the limits as to what is just and fair as all these organizations, be they big or small, interact with each other in our society. So one thing that I want to conclude right early on in our discussion is that when we talk about problems in our society, government is not the problem. There are some who would like to say, well, if we could just get rid of government or downsize it so badly that it no longer has any effect, then we could deal with these problems. That's not the solution. Government has a God-given solution, purpose, and its power is part of its God-given heritage. Government needs to have power to limit wrongdoing and injustice. Now, doesn't mean that government doesn't create problems. Of course it does, at various levels. But to say government is the problem is a misunderstanding of the purpose for which it has been created by God and with our consent, both in this country. Any comments to this point? I may be treading on some toes, but these things I think need to be said in our context. Now back to Scripture. We've said that God created a nation, government of Israel to establish justice and maintain justice. Well, it had another purpose too in that context, and that was to see that people worship the Lord Jehovah. In other words, it was a theocracy. It was not only to see that people were treated fairly and well, but it was to ensure that the people of Israel did not worship any other god except Jehovah or Yahweh. And so we have to acknowledge that as far as the Old Testament is concerned, the government of Israel was a theocracy as well as being a force for justice and care of all people and creating community. However, when we get to the New Testament, we're dealing with a different reality. There is still the understanding, it's not a major theme in the New Testament because it's moved on to other things, but it's still clearly understood among the Jewish people and Jesus himself that Government is in place because God put it there to carry out righteous purposes. You remember his little interchange with Pontius Pilate when he didn't answer and Pilate was trying to find an excuse to set him free. Finally, he got a little annoyed, I guess, at Jesus. He said, "Don't you understand I have the power to kill you or to free you?" And Jesus responded, "You wouldn't have any power at all if it weren't given you from above." Well, you know, the very clear understanding of the power of Rome wasn't indigenous, it was God-given. And the Apostle Paul certainly had a similar idea, and writing to the Romans in chapter 13 especially, he talks about the need to be subject to government, that the government has its rightful purpose, and we should recognize that and support it. So that's recognized there, and in other places there isn't a lot to do with government in the New Testament, but in some of those places, it's clear that the Old Testament idea that God established government and gave it power is still in force. Now, it's also clear in the New Testament that government doesn't always function the way it should and can be even evil. One little such incident is in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter and some of the others are brought before the authorities and told to toe the mark. They're not supposed to proclaim this Jesus as Messiah anymore. And the answer is, I'm sorry, but we have to obey God, not men. And men meaning people in power and in the government. And certainly when the book of Revelation was written, the author of that knew full well that Rome was not always fulfilling a God-given purpose. It's interesting in the time frame when Paul was writing, say in the 50s AD, the relationship with Rome was still fairly good. Their rebellion in Israel had not yet broken out, which happened a decade later in the 60s, and Rome came in and just simply crushed them and destroyed Jerusalem. That had not yet occurred. So Paul, who incidentally was a Roman citizen, could see the good that Rome was doing in the Pax Romana, if you remember that concept, that they kept the peace around the Mediterranean world. I mean, they did it a little bit by having the people under their thumb, but still, it was probably much better than all the tribes and individual groupings fighting each other. So that's when Paul's writing. 40 or so years later, when the book of Revelation was written, things had changed. Rome had begun persecuting the Christians, killing them, so on. And so the code language you find in Revelation talks about Rome as the beast. And it's pretty clear if you follow the code language that could recognize that government is not always a good thing. So, but it still does not change the overall biblical concept that government, like the church, has its own God-given purpose. Now, when I say that, is that new to you, or is that something that comes pretty natural? Because we don't talk about these things very much, and it's hard to know how people do look at the whole subject in our day. So I invite you, if you want to say anything at this point, to speak up. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. And, okay. I'm going to move on to our own history. Well, that's okay. Okay, here are the people coming over from Europe to populate this land, this New World, as it was called. And they used some of the biblical imagery to talk about what they understood they were doing. John Winthrop, I think, was the one who first talked in the Plymouth Bay colony about this new land as being a city set on a hill, which is a quote from Jesus himself. And he intended it, Winthrop, as a good thing. You know, it's going to be a shining light to bring illumination to darkness and to show a better day. So it was that kind of imagery. They also talked about this being the new Israel, you know, the new promised land. Thinking back to the experience of the Israelites escaping from Egypt and slavery in Egypt and going to the promised land. Well, they felt they were escaping from a very oppressive experience back in Europe. And here they were coming into new freedom, and so it would be like going to the promised land. They used images like this, which were straight out of the Bible. And those kinds of images, of course, have been very influential as our nation has developed over these 2.5 centuries. Well, I don't know if you go back to the colonies, even more time than that. But the the imagery has been positive in some respects. When we talk about City on the Hill, the New Israel, the concept of freedom, the concept of escaping from persecution, and so on, that has done good things for us, of course. It was somewhat influential on the writers of the Constitution. I mean, there were other influences on them, but that was there in the background. And so they built in the idea of a democracy, the idea of a Bill of Rights, well, came a little later. But it grew out of these concepts of the Bible. Now, there were other ways that it has influenced through the years. Trying to think, I gotta go back to my notes here. Well, okay, I cite the fact that some of these concepts were in the background in the fight against slavery. The abolitionists used some of these very same images to finally overcome the terrible heritage of slavery. These concepts were also very much present in thinking of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the whole movement for civil rights in the past century. That came out of a strong biblical, theological, church-based movement to influence our nation to finally overcome not only slavery, but some of the aftermath. I wouldn't say we've overcome it all, of Jim Crow and so on. And there are other ways that it's influenced us too. I'm just reading a biography of Harry Truman, and was reminded once again of the importance of the so-called Marshall Plan at the end of World War II. Now, Truman was very much involved in that. It could have been called the Truman Plan as well as the Marshall Plan, but the point was that here we, the conquerors, if you will, of Germany and Italy and the associated states, instead of crushing them, which was done after World War I, which then led to the backlash in the 30s, instead said, we need to care for those people who were so devastated in Europe. Now, part of the motivation, admittedly, was to keep the Russians from running over Europe, but that was certainly not all of it. And this author, David McCullough, who's done the biography of Truman, makes it very clear that both with Truman and Marshall, the primary motivation was humanitarian. We cannot let all those people starve. We must give them enough aid so that they can recover from the devastation of this awful war. I mean, I think that kind of reaction after conquering a people is pretty unique in history. And where does it come from except out of some of these biblical concepts that we are a city set on a hill, we are a promised land that is meant to care for God's people everywhere. Does that seem like an overstatement to you, or is that accord with how you kind of read history too? Or don't you care? Well, anyway, on the one hand, these positive concepts from Scripture have had a very beneficial influence in our country. On the other hand, it ain't all positive. And it wasn't with the Israelites either. If you remember that early on in the Old Testament, or in their history anyway, they began to think of themselves as God's chosen people because he pretty much made it clear to them that they were. Well, the purpose for which God chose them was that they would be a good example to the rest of humanity, that they would show the benefits of creating community, of establishing justice, of doing what was right, so that others would see that as an example and follow it. That was God's purpose for choosing a people, Israel. Well, may have been that way in the minds of some, especially the prophets, but for many, it took on the connotation that, well, we're better than others. God chose us. And so, we've got it made with God. We're his people, and others are kind of inferior and second class. And so they adopted those attitudes toward others. You remember the Samaritans, who themselves were Jews, but they weren't pure Jews. They had intermarried with the non-Jews, and so the real Jews looked down on them, and that comes through in Jesus' parables and so on. And then the Gentiles with everybody else, they were sort of second class in the world as far as the Jews were concerned once they misinterpreted the idea of the chosen people. Well, in our history, we've done the same thing. We have become, like them, in my estimation, in many ways arrogant toward the world. We are the best. We are not only the best nation, but the one that deserves to be at the top of the heap. And you know some of the ways that has shown up. We idealize our nation in contrast to other nations, to the point where we have, at times in our history, said, you can't criticize it, you can't criticize it. Love it or leave it. And that, of course, is a misinterpretation of saying that we may be God's chosen people. I think with Lincoln, who hit the nail on the head when he said America is God's almost chosen people. I like that concept. We almost made it, but no. So that is maybe what we should adopt, rather than the idea that we're the greatest, we're the chosen ones. We're God's almost chosen. Certainly God had good intentions for this country and still does, but we've got to be careful, because not only do we get arrogant, you know, and we say, well, you love it or you leave it, but it's the idea that we also have the right to tell other people what to do, and if they don't do it, make them do it. I mean, we may not like to face it, but that's a very strong strain in our history. I mean, it goes way back. Look what we did to Mexico. We didn't want them having the southwestern part of this continent, so we just took it away from them. Look how we acted towards Spain. Now, Spain certainly was no paragons of virtue, but we moved into Cuba, we moved into the Philippines on the excuse that we were going to free them from Spain, but then we took over the control of both countries, and of course both gained their independence eventually, but we left some bad influences there as a result. Or much more recently, in the 50s, we imposed the Shah on Iran, and look at the reaction to that. In the 70s, we participated in the overthrow of Allende in Chile, who was the popularly elected president of the country, and helped put in the dictator Pinochet, which was a disaster for the country for 20 years. We decided that Iraq needed to be freed, and so we, at huge cost, moved in there, and one would have to say, yeah, what did we accomplish? I mean, we have shown a lot of arrogance toward other nations, and in some ways it comes out of this idea that we're better than other nations. We're God chosen. We have a right to do these things. So we may not always say it in religious language. We say, well, we're the democracy that shows the way to the rest of the world. We're going to create democracy over there, but it's democracy that never quite becomes democracy in many countries. And we have to face up to this. It's these religious images, which are biblical, have also led us, like the ancient Israelites, to misunderstand our role as well as to understand it. So to be a city set in a hill or to be the promised land is two-edged sword, and it cuts both ways. Oh, you may have heard, I run into this every so often, that because we have acted arrogantly and so on to others, there are those around the world who understand this biblical imagery who say, we're the new Egypt. We're not moving into the promised land. We're acting like Egypt of old, crushing people and making them, or trying to make them do what we want them to do. So that's disturbing. It should be disturbing to those of us who understand the biblical history. To be compared to the old Egypt is not a good thing. So that's something we need to fess up to. So in the closing minutes here, let's talk about, okay, how shall we look at government? What is our understanding then of our government? First thing I think it's important to say is there is no one form of Christian government. Not a monarchy, not a democracy, not a dictatorship, not a socialist, not a communist. None of them should be called the Christian government. Certainly we can say that we're glad we're in a democracy and it's probably better than all the others, but if you have an enlightened monarch, you sometimes get better government than you do in a democracy. And surely a fair-minded review of some of the countries in Europe that are pretty socialistic, you'd have to say they do a pretty good job. So it's not clear-cut. Winston Churchill, if you recall, probably hit the nail on the head when he said democracy is the worst form of government until you compare it to every other possible form of government. They've all got their problems. We can't say that one is the perfect, the Christian form of government. Christians can live and function in all of these forms of government, though they might be much more under the heel, let's say, in communist USSR than here, or they may not be listened to in other places. And we do have the Islamic theocracies, or those who want them to be theocracies, which is a concern, and rightly so, that a nation where the majority are Muslims should not be able to dominate everybody in the country and say, you're going to do it our way. So, in spite of all the wrong things governments do and the wrong kinds of organizations they may undertake, we have to be careful not to equate Christianity with democracy. It may be the closest thing that we can come up with, but we have to not make it co-equivalent with the Christian faith or the Christian church, once again. Separation. That's one thing I think it's important. The government itself then is not the problem. It's what the government does and how it functions. Our task, at least let's talk now just about our country, because that's really where we live and where our influence can be. Our task is to critique government, to influence government in just and peaceful directions. At the same time, coming at it from the New Testament point of view, not the Old Testament, we don't live in a theocracy. There are those in the country who are fellow Christians who would like to say that our government should be a theocracy, that it should call itself a Christian government, a Christian land, and it should function with certain prescriptions right out of the Bible. And that we have to avoid. Let's take the New Testament understanding, not the Old Testament understanding. And that's a good biblical approach, by the way, and interpretation for Lutherans, because our understanding is that in many ways the teachings of Jesus and the life of Jesus have moved beyond some of the things in the Old Testament. And here would be one way in which that's true. We want this to be a government, a nation, which functions as God intends it to, to establish justice, to care for the needy, to provide for all, to adjudicate the various powers that exist within the country in a fair way, to function that way, but not to try to impose Christianity on people or to say you have to function according to certain proscriptions which are in the Bible. There is a distinction there, and it's an important one. We are for the God-given purpose of our country, but not to make it a theocracy. And so we would be critical, therefore, of some of our fellow Christians who do want it to be a theocracy, and who are quick to condemn those who don't agree with them on all points. So it's a touchy thing, but it's an important distinction. Government has a God-given purpose, but in our time, in our understanding, it's not a theocracy. Is that a fair distinction, do you think? Anybody want to quarrel with that?
Just a question, could you read or state again what your definition of theocracy is?
Yeah, a theocracy is a country which is set up government-wise to impose a certain kind of religion on people. And so it's, whereas the people rule in a democracy, supposedly God rules in a theocracy, but the people understand God a certain way and try to make it that way for everybody. Okay? Yes?
Well, I'm a little concerned about imposing our Christian values on the country through the government, but not our principles. I don't want, I think it's very dangerous to get the theology in there, in the theology rather than the principles. And as you were talking, I was thinking, our country is not tomato soup.
It's not made of what?
We're not tomato soup. We're
Oh,
not
yeah.
all tomatoes and blended together. We are a stew. And that stew is diminished if any one ingredient is taken away. And our country is made up of many, many kinds of religions and thoughts and ideas, and that's what makes us rich and makes us better. And if we start condemning some of those, even if we don't agree with them and violently don't agree with them, we don't resort to violence and oppression to deal with them.
Well said.
And the other thing, very practical, I think about, okay, now if we're imposing these requirements on people that you don't do this and you have to do this and you can't be that, how would I feel if that group then got elected into power and they were opposing their narrow and restrictive rules on us?
The only answer I can give, other than the fact that it's an ongoing process and there is no one simple answer, is that the overarching biblical understanding which we Christians accept, it comes largely from the Old Testament, but it's certainly affirmed in the New Testament, is that the government is here to create justice, equality, community, care for all, and that the things which make for those kinds of values are the things we need to advocate for. And to do that is a Christian function.
I want to make an ad for Charter for Compassion. There's this organization that was funded by a grant from TED, which is an organization that promotes all sorts of ideas. But it was a grant awarded to Karen Armstrong, and they founded this group that Charter for Compassion is based on the idea that the golden rule is the basis of every religion known to man. And I think that's another thing that we need to add to all the things that you mentioned is compassion. The people that we are angry at or fighting or don't agree with are human beings, they're God's children, and God loves them. And I think that's one of the basic principles that sometimes we forget when we are focused on the things that we feel very strongly about that are right and it's the way human beings should live.
Yeah, and we certainly need to affirm the openness of society to debate and argumentation and cross-fertilization and all those things that go with exactly what you're saying. You said it very well. Don't disagree at all. Yes?
I think perhaps one of the other functions that we look to government for is to establish and maintain order. And I think that's a place where we get into so much debate and problems about what that means. Because to establish order, does that mean that you can't ever challenge the established order?
Yeah, and some of that order changes with time, doesn't it? Yeah. Yes?
The discussion is coming right out now with the Olympics, whether you allow protests or do not. Some would say it's not the spirit of the Olympics. We're here for cooperation and competition. There's another place for that. And others would say, no, it's the spirit of the Olympics. Do protest. So
Yeah.
it's not an easy answer.
Right, they're not easy answers, are there? And I don't mean in anything I said to suggest there are, but to try to put it in this overall framework that we Christian citizens, and we'll talk more specifically about that next week, need to see government in a certain way, which is that it has a God-given function. It's not evil. And there are those in our society who act as if government's evil, and the less of it, the better. Now, it may be that it overdoes its function in a lot of things and needs to be trimmed, but we always have to come at it from the understanding that basically government's a good thing, and we need to make it even better, not just try to cut it down. Yes?
We have to look at our history. Whenever, government usually comes in the picture only when the private sector, quote unquote, has made a mistake or caused a problem. Not that government is better than or necessarily solves the problem, but it usually doesn't get involved until the other guys have messed it up.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a good point, because basically government is supposed to adjudicate these injustices, if we can call it that occur, and swing things back more in the direction of justice and equality and fairness and goodness for all the citizens, as well as the rest of the world, because more and more we're an interlinked, interdependent world. So it's not just about us, it's about the whole world too. Well, are we about out of time? I guess we are, yeah. Okay, thank you for being here. I hope, if possible, you'll be here next week and we'll dig in deeper.